Until the mid-20th century, Jews throughout the world remained an incredibly insular group. Intermarriage averaged just 0.5%. And that very insularity has made Jews the perfect specimens for genetic research.
And so Jews have been the focus of many studies.
But that begs the question, what is a Jew? Are Jews genetically pure, or are Jews converts from other faiths? Author John Entine investigated that very question in his book, Abraham's Children, Race, Identity, and the DNA of the Chosen People.
Many Jews for a long time had been told, based on books like Arthur Koestler's The 13th Tribe, that Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, are really converts. That almost all Ashkenazi Jews were once part of a empire in what is now Russia called the Khazarian Empire that existed between the 7th and the 10th century.
But as genetic science has developed since Mr. Koestler wrote his book, the evidence points the other way, suggesting that Jews are Jews by DNA.
On the male line, about 75 to 80% of males do have Middle Eastern ancestry. On the female side, 50% of females do not have Middle Eastern ancestry, 50%.
Why do we find such a marked difference between male and female lines?
It looks like many Jewish males from Rome, from different parts of the world, came to settle in areas that were either pagan or Christian. They took on local wives.
But it gets even more interesting. You, or someone you know, may claim to be a Cohen, or Jewish priest by oral tradition. Jews who claim this distinction believe that they are direct descendants of Aaron, Moses' brother, who lived about 3 millennia ago. Well, if that's the case, then presumably geneticists could trace Aaron's male chromosome through male Kohanim, because, but for distinct mutations or markers, the male chromosome does not change through the generations. So what did the scientists find?
They found out that there was a set of 6 markers that trace back 3,300 years, give or take a few hundred years. They were flabbergasted. Here, for the first time, you had DNA reaffirming Jewish tradition. DNA was found in 70 to 80% of people who 3,300 years later claim that they are of Cohen ancestry.
And the research on the Kohanim produced even more staggering results. In southern Africa, a tribe of black Africans, known as the Lemba, claimed to be Jewish. So scientists decided to test this assertion through DNA analysis and focused on the Lemba's priests, or Buba.
More than 50% of the priests carried markers that were the exact same markers that were found in Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi priests, and also traced back to the time of Aaron. Absolutely remarkable.
So, the genetic evidence strongly suggests that Jews can trace their common heritage through their DNA. But that research also shows that Jews have developed a series of genetic mutations that have led to devastating diseases.
Here's just some of the Jewish diseases: Bloom syndrome, Canavan disease, Gaucher's, breast and ovarian cancer, cystic fibrosis.
All told, genetic Jews, especially Ashkenazi Jews, as a group, are predisposed to about 40 different diseases. But why? Well, it's the result of what is known as the bottleneck effect.
Into the 1400s, Ashkenazi Jewry probably did not number more than 15 to 25,000 people. Because it grew out of such a tiny population and grew so quickly, it also retained a kind of genetic insularity.
So that insular genetic pool, carrying markers for 40 some odd diseases, spread from the founder population of 20,000 to today's 8 million Ashkenazi Jews, who represent 80% of world Jewry. And now geneticists posit a theory as to why these deadly diseases have not died off as a result of simple evolutionary science.
A team of American scientists is proposing that certain genetic disorders arose in Ashkenazi Jews because the same genes carried increased intelligence.
In other words, if an individual inherits both defective genes, they will suffer from the disease. But these scientists believe that if an individual carries just one copy of the recessive gene, that gene leads to increased dendrite production in the brain, resulting in higher IQs. While it may not be PC to suggest that Jews are smarter genetically, consider these statistics.
The average IQ in the world is around 100 or so. The average Jewish IQ is between 107 and 117 on tests that have been done over a period of 70 years.
And if you isolate verbal IQ, Jews score 123 on average. Controversial data, no doubt. So after the lecture, I spoke with some members of the audience, and I asked them about John Entine's central thesis. Do they buy that Jews share common ancestors and therefore share common characteristics?
I absolutely do share his premise. I think I was brought up with that feeling that there was some advantage to my Jewish heritage, but then there were also many things, both physical and cultural, that came along with that, which were very, very sad things.
There's such social taboos in our society for discussing any of those kinds of things, and yet it's something that all of us have a sense about, that there are different populations of people who may have different strengths, perhaps in athletics, perhaps in intelligence.
Do you want to learn more about the genetic journey of the Jewish people? Well, you can read more about it in John Entine's book, Abraham's Children, Race, Identity, and the DNA of the Chosen People.
What's so interesting about the Kohanim, it's provided a way to look at the whole question of the lost tribes. One of the things I explore on again in the larger level of Jewish ancestry is the issue of are there lost tribes? We hear lots of stories about groups in India, groups in the Urals, the Ethiopians, and so forth. The key to understanding this, and one of the great and most fascinating discoveries, relates to the Kohanim. But for those of you who are not conversant with the story of the Kohanim, about 15 years ago, Karl Skoretsky, then a Toronto nephrologist who since relocated to Haifa and runs the genetic and nephrology program at Technion, got a flash one day when he's Sephardic, got a flash when another Jew stood up to give the Birkas Kohanim at his synagogue. And he said, you know something, if it's really true that we can track through the Y chromosome, then this guy and I, we both say by our oral tradition that we're descendants of Aaron, or maybe a Zadokite, because this is very unclear by the Bible. Zadokites also might be a separate line of the Kohanim, but clearly a Jewish priesthood line that goes back theoretically to the time of Aaron, at least to the time of Moses and Aaron, if in fact their stories are not apocryphal and they did live. He says we should be able to test this genetically. And he put together this project, and they took the Y chromosome tests of many people who proclaimed that they were Kohanim by oral tradition, and they found out about 55% of them shared a genetic mutation that traced back to the time when, if Aaron lived, he would have lived. So, in fact, they were related to the same person. So at least 55% of the people who claim to Kohanim share an identical, not a close, an identical ancestor going back 2,500 years. Again, a remarkable story of genetic witness to the traditions of Judaism and the Israelites. Absolutely amazing. Why is it not 100%? Paternity mistakes, referred to as affairs, perhaps, in other ways. Or also the fact that there might be multiple lines, the Zadokite line that I referred to, and during certain periods in Jewish history, during the Hellenic period, for instance, there was some ways to kind of wheedle your way into the Kohanim that ultimately was clamped down upon after that. So as I mentioned, it's really been interesting in using that kind of research to, along with regular DNA research, to go after the quest of the lost tribes. So I'll just mention a couple of things. One thing I like to talk about is anthropologists. Anthropologists think they know what they're talking about. Genetics has really changed the equation about you can fool an anthropologist sometimes, but you can't fool the genes.
So there was a time, for instance, back in the late 1980s, you might remember, I think it was called Operation Exodus, when the Ethiopians were rescued and brought to Israel because they claimed that they have Jewish ancestry and that they're genetically Jews and so forth. They've done enough genetic testing now to, at very least, put a huge question mark, very, very big, to suggest that they probably are not genetic Jews that trace back to the Middle East. They are probably converts from the 5th and 6th century during a time when the Ethiopian government was very, very sympathetic to Judaism and embraced it, and it ultimately spread through the culture. They've done some Y testing. They've done some female DNA testing. Some more definitive studies will be out in the next couple of years. But right now it seems like, yes, they are Jews, but they are Jews because they took on the culture. They never went through a formal conversion process, probably no less Jewish than most of us here because of our ancestry back to the early medieval times, but they are not genetic Jews like on the Y chromosomal side, the male side, that stretches all the way back to the Middle East. But what about another tribe called the Lemba? Here's a Lemba, and the Lemba had the same tradition as the Ethiopians. Many of them claimed they were of Jewish ancestry. A lot of them claimed that they were of Jewish ancestry, but they were practicing Christians. But they still had Jewish rituals, and they all talked about it. And anthropologists, who you saw easily fooled, used to say, very liberal in their own minds, but they'd say very patronizingly, oh, these Lemba probably conflated their folkloric history with a Jewish colonialist, or maybe a Christian evangelical who believes in some of the lost tribes myths, and they absorbed it into their own culture. And they can't really be Jewish. And they were very condescending about that. Even Stephen Jones, a very famous geneticist from the UK who did a PBS special on this in 1997, 1998, mocked the idea that they could be genetically Jewish. Well, it happens to be this man here is not only a Lemba, he is a Buba. A Buba is the priestly clan of the Lemba, and a clan that maintains its Jewishness and maintains its Jewish practices and thinks of itself as still very stridently and coherently Jewish. Well, Tudor Parfit, who had been very instrumental in writing about the Ethiopian Jews, he's a Christian, an anthropologist, incredible man from England, very skeptical of the claims of the Lemba, paired together with geneticist Michael Hammer in Arizona, geneticist at the Genetic Anthropology Center in London, and he went and he took the DNA of the Buba, and not only did they show coeneem markers, more than 60 to 65% of Buba have the same coeneem marker that is found in a less of a percentage, 55% of American and European Jews. On the male line, the Buba are more coeneem, are more coherently and consistently Jewish than American Jews or European Jews. Absolutely remarkable. Again, on the female side, they married local women, which is why their skin is black. Their overall DNA, if they had autosomal tests, would probably be about 98% black. But on that one line that we can trace right now, the Y chromosomal line, the surname line, which for some reason we give huge import to, even though it's just a tiny strand of our DNA, it creates our identity, even though, again, the autosomal line, the huge amount of their DNA is almost all African. But on the male line, the Bubas are almost certainly descended of the Semites. Tudor Parfit then went and reconstructed the history with the clues that he now had, and found out that they had probably, a group of Israelites, Jews, had left Israel in the first, somewhere around the time of Jesus, the first century, came over, settled in Yemen, established a city there called Senna. He went and did genetic testing of kids there, and it was amazing evidence, and showed the DNA trail that led down to the coast. They landed probably near Zanzibar Island, not far off the coast of Tanzania, went down, and what's so interesting here, you see down there where it says the Great Zimbabwe, right on the, what is in Zimbabwe? How many of you are familiar with the Great Zimbabwe is? The Great Zimbabwe is the only architectural marvel in Africa that really shows any kind of sophistication or understanding of literally how what was going to be the future in building. There are really no examples of it. Almost every other culture has one, and is literally the pride and joy of Black Africa, and is the reason Zimbabwe, the name of the country, was named after the Great Zimbabwe. And it's considered, when they talk about the great African cultures, they talk about the Great Zimbabwe. I hate to tell Zimbabweans, but the Great Zimbabwe was almost certainly built by Jews. This has been confirmed and discussed. It's obviously very controversial, but on the male side, again, their overall DNA was quite black by then because we're talking probably 13th, 14th centuries. But on the male line, they were built by people who were higher. I know all of you are asking, so are there more doctors and lawyers who are Lemba? I mean, what's the sign that they're Jewish? That actually is somewhat true. They are considered a bit of an elite group within the Black African culture. But these are obviously very controversial and very touchy kinds of things with doses of speculation built in, but these are the kind of questions that are being asked by geneticists today to try to reconstruct genetic and genealogical history. This is the MTDA human migration chart, and the reason I put this is because when you look at the deep history of many kinds of societies, you really have to look at the mtDNA, because Y chromosomal DNA obviously cannot survive for a long time. So when you're really looking at deep history, almost all of it involves looking at your mtDNA. But I think one of the points I want to bring home on this is the impact that discovering Israelite ancestry is having on various people. I think one of the most interesting stories that I came across was the story of a priest in Albuquerque, a guy named William Sanchez. This is in around 2002. Bennett's service had only been in existence for a couple of years. And William Sanchez saw a story on PBS about sending in your DNA for testing. And he sent it in, sent a swab in, and the reason he was piqued by this interest is because he grew up in a Hispano community that had all these what now would be called crypto-Jewish rituals that they did. They covered mirrors when someone died and they were sitting Shiva, but not knowing they were sitting Shiva. They would sweep some of the dirt in the middle of the room at certain times. They had a dreidel, which may or may not be of Jewish, that only goes back a few hundred years and may be a amalgam of a couple of rituals, but things that made him curious about why their Hispanic community seemed, their little tight community that he lived in, seemed different from some of the Christian Hispanos in that community. So he sent in his DNA. This is in the early days when FTDNA wasn't that big. And so Bennett calls him on the telephone and says, can I please speak to William Sanchez? Because that's all he had was William Sanchez. Bennett actually, when he got some interesting data, he would call people up on the telephone. And the guy says, hi, this is Bill Sanchez. He says, Mr. Sanchez, he says, I don't usually call people up, but when we get some of the data that we got from you, it's pretty interesting, so we decided that we'd give you a call. He says, do you know that you might be descended from priests? And he laughs. He says, oh, yeah, does this make sense? I am a priest. And stunned silence from Bennett Greenspan on the other side. He says, you're a priest? He says, absolutely. He says, well, I didn't mean Catholic priests. I meant Jewish priests. And it was an amazing revelation that just struck Father Sanchez as revelatory. And the man it literally changed his life. He threw himself into genealogical and genetic research. He's had more than 70 of his family members tested. More than 38 of them have either a J1 or a J, which definitely marks them as Semitic ancestry. Many of them have direct ancestry that probably indicates that they are Kohanim. He's probably associated, a cousin of Kohanim rather than a direct ancestor. And it's had a dramatic influence on his church as well. Hundreds of members of that church now wear this. And they go around saying, we are Jews by ancestry and Christians by belief. A fair number of his cousins didn't shake them at all. They are absolutely proud of their Jewish ancestry. The Catholic Church hates it, is absolutely apoplectic that they're wearing these things and talking about these things. They've introduced Jewish rituals into their Mass, things that probably were part of every Catholic Mass until it was withdrawn because of anti-Jewish prejudice over the centuries, but probably if Jesus lived would be proud of them because Jesus was a Jew and they're celebrating the Jewish dimensions to their ancestry, but again does not sit well with the mainstream Orthodox Catholic movement. But many, at least a half a dozen of Father Sanchez's cousins have either begun formal conversion processes to become Jews or are just openly declaring themselves Jews, recognizing that under Jewish law, of course, they're not. And this is absolutely startling, again, when you come down to the fact that if you did their autosomal DNA, probably their Jewishness probably represents 20% of their DNA. Their Jewish ancestry, their Semitic ancestry, 80% of it is probably a combination of Christians who they've married over the years, and the fact that on the maternal side, remember we talked about how Jewish traders and others in the early medieval period took on pagan or Christian wives. Well, most of the Jews who came over as a result of the Holy Inquisition, some of them who had converted to Christianity and some of them who founded crypto-Jewish communities in Mexico and elsewhere, ultimately married Native Americans, almost all. And so his actual ancestry on the female side is Native American. So again, his autosomal ancestry, his overall ancestry is only a little bit Jewish, but for people, there's something incredibly powerful about a religion that is tribal, that is a mixture of blood, that is a culture, faith. It's not just faith. We are not just a faith-based religion. We are all these things together. And that has an incredible, almost mystical appeal to people and is so powerful that it has transformed the lives of person after person.